Okay, so we will not delay this any longer. This is the last talk of this series of lectures on medical informatics, and what a really nice way to end this cycle. Today we have with us Professor Salvatore Mangione. He's a professor at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we knew him because he has produced a set, besides all these activities, he has produced a set of landmark papers about what is happening with the bedside skills of physicians at the moment, and especially on the auscultation part. And there was a long promise to invite him to come to Porto. Thank you so much for accepting our challenge of coming here. We had the luxury of having a previous talk yesterday by Professor Manda, and I'm so glad that today we will something more, a bit more, the history of medicine, and how can we view cardiac auscultation? How should we teach cardiac auscultation? And I'm very excited about this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I hope you have many questions in the end. And
thank you. Thanks so much, Miguel, and thanks for having me. It's been a couple of interesting days. I've seen so much work that you're doing that I'm excited to really help out and collaborate. I'm not really sure. I kind of insisted to give this talk, mostly because most of you are not from the medical field, and that's the way we teach medical students, something that you're trying to convert into an electronic format. So that can give you a sense, a little bit of what we do out there. Now, 40% of all errors in physical exam are in the field of auscultation. So how does a physician make a diagnosis? 80% is based on history, which means what the patient says. 10% is based on physical exam, and 10% is based on the laboratory. Now, more recent data show that the impact of the laboratory has increased, probably because we are losing clinical skills, or maybe because the laboratory is becoming so sophisticated. But physical exam contributes around 10%, and half of all errors that we make in physical exam are in the field of auscultation. Now, physical exam, of course, is much more than auscultation. In fact, in general, you start by looking at the person, and probably most of the information comes from inspection. William Osler was one of the greatest physicians in US history, used to say that all of medicine is observation. And observation is not easy. You can observe a lot by watching, said an American baseball player. And Leonardo da Vinci used to say that people come in three flavors: those that see only when shown, and those that just can't see. So observation is not easy. Palpation, it's an aspect. Percussion comes in 1761, mostly because of an Austrian physician who, as a child, used to go down to the basement of the family tavern and watch his father percuss barrels of wine to see if they were full or empty. And that's how Leopold Eulenbrugger came up with the idea of percussion. And then lastly, auscultation is coming up in 1 year for its 200th anniversary, even though the book was actually only published in 1819. But the invention of the stethoscope by Laennec is 1816, so a year from now. Lastly, you need time to put it together. And this is what William Osler used to call contemplation. Now, in terms of inspection, you look at the feeding pipe, which is the venous exam. You look at the exit pipe, which is the arterial exam. And finally, you go directly for the pump, which is done through the patient and observation of the point of maximal impulse. And ultimately, it's auscultation. So it's 5 fingers that allow you to grab a cardiac diagnosis, and only one of those fingers is auscultation, but it's probably the most difficult and the most challenging. So I'm not going to talk about the others, but I'm going to give you a few examples of how the art of medicine can bring a diagnosis, sometimes purely on inspection. So this case is one actually of my heroes. You're evaluating a 62-year-old Roman emperor. He's a medical school dropout with a long interest in travel, architecture, poetry, and all things Greek. In fact, in Rome, they call him the Greekling, which is not a compliment. Then they giggle a lot because he also has a Spanish accent. Then he has 3 senators executed and the giggling stops. And all of this because he's competitive, driven, impatient, irascible, even had his chief architect executed because he disagreed with his building tastes. At the present time, he's too short of breath to argue with you or have you executed. You notice that the belly is swollen, the neck veins are distended, and the legs are edematous. And he tells you that he's had a lot of nosebleeds, which is very suggestive of high blood pressure. So you get the point. A type A personality, driven, high blood pressure, and now anasarcically some sort of heart failure. Point out how difficult it is to observe. Is there anything unusual you see in the bust of this emperor that is not supposed to be there? Now, he has a chipped nose. That's fine. Is there anything unusual you see in this bust in a time when Roman sculpture was almost photographic? And therefore, if it's shown in the bust, he really had it. Also because this is the most sculpted emperor in Roman history. We have 130 busts, and all of them show the same finding. So anybody, and you don't need to be a physician to pick it up. I take drawing classes, and the first time I pointed this to my instructor, immediately saw it. So what I'm referring to is in his ears, and there's only one ear that is shown in this picture. What's unusual about that ear? This crease, that's not normal. An earlobe crease goes under the term of Frank sign because Sanders T. Frank, a physician in practice in the 70s, wrote a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine saying, I have a lot of patients in my practice who have a deep earlobe crease, and they all have coronary artery disease. Has anybody ever written it up? And the New England Journal of Medicine, no, welcome to Frankenstein. Turns out that every single bust of Hadrian has it, whether they are in Rome, whether they are in Naples, whether they are in Madrid, whether they are in Athens, even in Florence, and his coin has a bizarre earlobe. So what is an earlobe crease? An earlobe crease is an infarct of the earlobe. So the earlobe has terminal circulation, very much like your carotids and your coronaries. If you have atherosclerotic disease and you infarct the earlobe, you're very likely to have atherosclerotic disease in your carotids and your coronaries and be prone to heart attacks and strokes. That's the value of that. Now, there is a congenital form, but I'm more really referring to the acquired form, which again goes under the terms of Frank sign, first described by William Frank. Let me give you some study. This is a paper written up about 1,000 admitted to the hospital. 74% of those that had an earlobe crease had coronary artery disease compared to 16% of those without a crease. And this has been confirmed by more than 60 studies. Now, these are 3 important people for the future of Europe. The one on the left self-combusted on his penis. The one in the center had to give away the chairmanship of the European Central Bank to the guy on the right, who's calling the shots. Does he have good ears? He does not. So we may have a problem. Now, he also has an earlobe crease, but he's an old man. So in an old man could be a wrinkle in time. In Mario Draghi, who's a young man, relatively young, may be more important. Now, what happened to Hadrian? Hadrian died of heart failure because Cassius Dio tells us about it. Here's what he writes. Despite his recourse to certain charms and magics, which relieved his dropsy for a time, the emperor soon filled up with water again, and his breathing got shorter. As he was in fact continuously getting worse, so that he could be said to have been dying day after day, he began to long for death. Often he asked for poison or a sword, even offered money and immunity, but no one would give them to him. He should have gone to the Netherlands. Finally, he abandoned his careful regimen, and by indulging in unsuitable food and drinks, he met his death, shouting aloud the popular saying, "The many doctors have killed the king." He actually went across the river. He went to Castle Sant'Angelo, but before dying, he penned this little poem, which is the only thing we have left of him. He wrote, "Little son of mine, roamer and charmer, guest and companion of my body, where will you soon have to go? Pale, cold, naked, probably to a place where you won't be able to crack jokes anymore." That place was actually a mausoleum built across the river that became Castle Sant'Angelo. So he has an earlobe crease. The man in the center, I've been watching for a long time. He has an earlobe crease. He got it in office. So there is still hope. Let's review. Here is him. Let's magnify the presidential ear. He's got a preauricular crease, which makes the likelihood of coronary artery disease even more significant. And he also has hair in the canal, which is visually unappealing. But is also predictive of coronary artery disease. In fact, there is a study from India and two from the US that suggest that if you have hair in the canal, you are more likely to have coronary artery disease. Why? Because you are in a hypertestosteronic state. Interestingly enough, in Chinese acute atlases, the earlobe is the projection site for the heart. So that is kind of interesting. So this is me, and in 2006, the students gave me a portrait as their best teacher. And I had this picture taken, and my left ear is intact. Then she ran for office, and my left ear developed a crease. So if, like me and George Bush, you have an earlobe crease, I have words of wisdom for you. If on an ear there is a crease, do not assume the life will cease. If hair is knotted in the ear, do not assume that death is near. So if when walking down the street, an ear with hair and crease you meet, don't give the gent a dreadful fright. Don't hint infarction is in sight. It's just a sign. But it tells you the power of observation. Take a look at this Dutch painter. His name was Dick Cat, and he lived between the two great wars. He died a few months after the Germans invaded his country. Is there anything unusual that you notice in this man? The nails are funny. In fact, the whole fingers are shaped like the clubs of a drum, the sticks of a drum. Notice also that his nose is dusky, the tip of the chin is dusky, and the lips are dusky. So he has cyanosis and clubbing. Now, I want you to squint, which is what they teach you to do when you take a drawing class, because when you squint, you see things better. So what you're seeing when you squint is that this man has fingers that are pink, toes that are blue, and so he's half a Smurf. The top is pink, the bottom is blue. This tells you that he has a communication between the aorta and the pulmonary artery, and blood is going from the pulmonary artery into the aorta in the descending part of the body. We call this differential cyanosis and clubbing. Once again, the power of observation. I want you to look at this man. This is a video I took. And notice the jolt at the neck. Notice that it's flickering the earlobes. Notice that the earlobes have a crease. So this man was waiting for a heart transplant at Jefferson. And what he has is the jolt of venous regurgitation from a leaky tricuspid valve. And that jolt of the earlobe is referred still to this day as the Lancisi sign, from Giovanni Lancisi, physician to 3 popes, in the sense that he killed them all, but he had good bedside manner. Now, this is Ludwig van. I took this picture in Vienna, and he looks pissed in death as he was throughout life. But the reason why I'm bringing him up is because of this opening of the scherzo in the 9th Symphony. Let's review it again. This is a triple lilt. It goes like tum-tara, 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 which is very similar to this. So what is this tum-tara that I'm playing? That's actually mitral stenosis. So if you have a narrow mitral valve, when it opens, will create an extra sound called an open snap. And the lilt is very much a tum-tara, tum-tara, tum-tara. Why am I bringing it up? Recently, there was a paper published on Beethoven claiming that some of the sounds he incorporated were actually sounds that he heard on himself. They were more talking about arrhythmias. But I really have thought for quite a while that maybe when he played this triple lilt at the beginning of the 9th, he might have actually referred to the sound, the inner sound that he heard. Remember, he was deaf, but he was deaf to the outer sound. Why am I bringing this up? Beethoven dies of cirrhosis. We have an autopsy. And the autopsy was actually made by a very famous Viennese pathologist, and he has a cirrhotic liver. However, reports from contemporaries tell us that he didn't drink that much. So why did he get cirrhosis? People that have mitral stenosis back up blood so much through the lungs to develop pulmonary hypertension, stasis in the liver, and cardiac cirrhosis. Maybe. But this serves us as an introduction to auscultation. So let's do the first case. 44-year-old bodybuilder of Austrian descent, later recycled as a semi-successful action hero, comes to see you complaining of a throbbing headache, which he attributes to his obsession to become one day governor of a large American state. His blood pressure is 160/50. So he has a high systolic and a low diastolic, which is very suggestive of aortic regurgitation. And you look at his neck veins and you look at his arterial pulse. The way I'm going to show it to you is by showing you a video of the Harvey simulator. And by placing a cotton swab over the carotid, I'll give you a sense of the carotid upstroke. Let's take a look. So what you see on top flickering cotton swab is actually the carotid. And put a cotton swab on the carotid and use it as a fulcrum. Dr. Harvey did that. This is referring to the venous pulse. So we say that the venous pulse and the arterial pulse are marching to the beat of two different drummers. This is twice as fast, and it's out of sync. Now, when you look at this, you also notice that the pulse is brisk and double. We call that bispherians, and it's very suggestive of aortic regurgitation. That brisk pulse was first put in the literature by Dr. Dominic Corrigan. It's still referred to as the Corrigan's pulse. So people with aortic regurgitation have a brisk pulse. Now let's take a listen to the sound of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Okay, so when we teach medical students, in many ways we do what you're doing developing an algorithm for the analysis of heart murmurs. The way I teach them by following an algorithm, and I tell them, do you hear a murmur? And of course, there is a murmur in this cycle. The next question in the algorithm is, does this murmur qualify as lots of noise? I call it lots of noise. There is noise in systole and noise in diastole. And this murmur does qualify as lots of noise. If that's the case, you are in a part of the algorithm that has only 4 possible solutions. Severe aortic regurgitation, which is Arnold Schwarzenegger, severe mitral regurgitation, a patent ductus arteriosus, and a pericardial friction rub. To make it easier, this is the algorithm I was telling you about, and I'll review it later. Let's do a cartoon of this murmur. And you'll see that there is indeed a murmur in systole and a murmur throughout diastole. So this thing does qualify as of noise. Again, it sounds like, and the diagnosis of aortic regurgitation is pretty much established. I also want to point out that in addition to the murmurs, lots of noise murmurs, he has a click. There is an extra sound in early systole, an early systolic click, an ejection sound click. Why is that relevant? Because this may tell us why Arnold Schwarzenegger ended up with aortic regurgitation. So, in 1994, Arnold Schwarzenegger goes to UCLA, University of Southern California Medical School, and is told, you have aortic regurgitation. We need to operate you. Now, most common cause of aortic regurgitation across the planet is rheumatic fever, still. The next one, still common, is syphilis, which would have been quite appropriate for Arnold Schwarzenegger, would have made Maria Shriver really happy. Turned out to be the most common reason in the US, which is not acquired and inflammatory, but is congenital and degenerative. What Arnold Schwarzenegger had was an aortic valve that instead of having 3 cusps, had only 2. 2 to 5% of the population is born like that. In their 40s, the valve may leak, and now they have aortic regurgitation like him. In their 50s, the valve may stenose, may narrow, may even calcify. And that's what happened to Robin Williams, who actually had to pass out on stage to convince his physician that this murmur he had was the real murmur of aortic stenosis. Just to tell you that physicians have a hard time with auscultation. Even Robin Williams, who was in rehab every 4 or 5 months, was missed. He had to pass out in order to convince his physicians that he had true aortic stenosis. Now, there is another reason to have an early systolic click. Not only the bicuspid valve will click, but a dilated aorta may click too, which brings us to this picture of Abraham Lincoln. This was taken by Alexander Gardner in 1863, just a couple of months after the Battle of Gettysburg, 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg. And if you squint, you notice that the left foot of the president is fuzzy. In fact, the president himself noticed it, and he told Gardner, look at that, my foot is fuzzy. And Gardner said, Mr. President, that's because you have a brisk circulation. And he was right. So here is how it goes. If you have aortic regurgitation, each time you eject very briskly, may even bob your head. And as a matter of fact, there is an equivalent of that as a result of a dilated aorta in the French poet Alfred de Musset. Alfred de Musset who led to the de Musset sign, used to bob his head very briskly as a result of aortic regurgitation. So people looked at that picture of Lincoln and said, Abraham Lincoln had aortic regurgitation. How about that? Why the foot? Because in those years, it took 2 minutes to take a picture. And if in 2 minutes you have 140 brisk ejections, your aorta, you will have 140 brisk jolts of your foot, and your foot will be fuzzy. So then the question became, did Lincoln have aortic regurgitation? The most common reason in those years, the reason of Alfred de Musset, was syphilis. Could Abe Lincoln have syphilis? Of course not. He's like an angel in America. So they gave him Marfan syndrome. Tall and lanky, Marfan syndrome. Turns out that he did not have Marfan syndrome, at least in the family. But recently a letter surfaced where he wrote a friend as a young man expressing concerns for having gone with the lady of the night and possibly having caught something infectious. So it might have been syphilis after all. Back to him. So what happened to him? Well, they say, Arnold, we have to operate, and you have to get an artificial valve, and you have to be on a blood thinner. And he says, I can't be on a blood thinner. I'm an action hero. I jump from planes. So they say, well, we're going to do something very creative. We're going to get your pulmonic valve and put it on the aortic area, and you don't need anticoagulation. Then we're going to get a cadaveric donor valve, put it in the pulmonic area, will last a lot longer, and you will do well. Unfortunately, life is what happens to you when you're busy making plans, so he bled a lot after surgery. They had to reopen him up 3 times, which means now he has a scar that goes from here to here, which unless they Photoshop it, they can't really show it on movies. Since the guy cannot act, and the only reason why people go and see his movie to admire the pectoralis major, with his movie career in shambles, he had to reinvent himself as a politician with dire consequences for the state of California and the planet at large, and all of this because of a lousy bicuspid valve that clicked. Which brings us to Maria Shriver. The Kennedy women age badly, but Maria Shriver has aged really badly. 20 years of Arnold Schwarzenegger at your side will do that. Here she is. The power of observation. She looks awful. Now, would it help you if I were to remind you that her uncle, John Kennedy, the president, had Addison's disease? Would it help you if I were to remind you that her mother had Addison's disease? The mother was the sister of President Kennedy. And that her medical records were stolen at UCLA a few years ago, probably for blackmailing suspect she has Addison's. And maybe these augmented palmar crisis. Right. So that's the first lots of noise. Let's see the next one. A 24-year-old medical student comes to see you complaining of a sharp, excruciating chest pain, worsened by swallowing and exhalation, and gradually developing after an upper respiratory tract infection. When you listen, you pick up the following noise. Okay, so notice that this is a lot of noise. It's in systole, it's in diastole, it's crunching, and it gets when the person breathes out. So this is a friction rub. It's a pericardial friction rub. The student has pericarditis as a complication of a viral infection. This is another lots of noise. So in the algorithm, noise in systole, noise in diastole, severe aortic regurgitation, pericardial friction rub. You also notice that this patient has shortness of breath, a fast heart rate, and the lungs are clear and the neck veins are distended. That tetrad is very important to suspect the worst complication of an inflammation of the pericardial sac. So the bag in which the heart is contained is inflamed, and the major problem is if there is a lot of fluid pouring into this bag, the heart will be squeezed. The term French is called tamponade. And the heart is unable to fill because it's compressed, and the person will die. It's called tamponade, and it's the worst complication, and that's what this patient has. Now, there are good ways to identify tamponade early on so that we can drain the pericardial sac. And by the way, there is a very famous historical figure that probably died of that, died of tamponade. Let me tell you about him. This is actually quite timely since will be shown in 2 months in Turin. It's April 7, 30 AD, and that city I showed you before is the Jerusalem of the 1st century AD. In fact, you see here the Antonia Fortress, the Upper Town, the Old Town, Gethsemane, and the Kidron Valley. So it's April 7, 30 AD. You're outside Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, and it's the northern gate. I spent a month there as a medical student, and it's the busiest part of town. So if you want to have public executions and scare the populace, you do it there. And you're watching 3 men being executed by an occupying imperial power. The execution started at 9 in the morning, has been going on for 6 hours, when suddenly one of the 3 men cries a loud shout and then dies. 2 hours later, one of the soldiers passes by, and to make sure that he's dead, spears him on the side. And according to an eyewitness, blood and water come out. And according also to this linen, which is kept in Turin, it's the Shroud of Turin, the Sindon, and has a very clear-cut wound stain on the right side, which has been analyzed by 3 separate university groups, found to be human blood, AB in type, which is very common in the Middle East, but rare in Europe. And in addition, the blood is very orange. Blood is usually red. It's so orangey. Well, because when they analyzed it, they found it chock full of bilirubin. What is bilirubin? It's that pigment that makes us jaundiced, which is contained in red cells as a, not really as bilirubin, but as a early product that may lead to bilirubin, and gets liberated from the red cell if you get so ferociously flogged and whipped as he was. So again, it's very interesting that there is a lot of bilirubin, which is consistent with what happened to Christ. So what happened to Christ? Why did he die? Why am I taking this tangent from tamponade? On the cross, people died of respiratory failure, of asphyxia, mostly because the only way that they could breathe was by inhaling passively through gravity and exhaling actively by pushing themselves on the feet, using the wrists as fulcrum, and in an excruciating fashion, which literally means from the cross, painfully exhale. This eventually led to fatigue, and the person stopped breathing, and they died of respiratory failure. If they didn't do it quickly enough, 1 to 2 days, the Romans broke their legs. It was called the crurifragium, and the person died immediately because could not exhale anymore. We know that he died in 6 hours. That's too fast. Even Pilate said, how can it be? Just 6 hours, that's too fast. We also know that he shouted at the moment of death, because there are 2 evangelists, one of them being a physician, which is Luke, that tells us that. And shouting is not what people in respiratory failure do. But shouting is what people that have a cardiac rupture do. So there is a British pathologist that has suggested what really happened that caused his death was the rupture of the heart, which makes a lot of sense. This was somebody who went through tremendous ordeal. He was even witness to sweat blood, which has been reported in people under tremendous stress, blitz victims, rape victims, people that are about to be executed. And this might have easily led to the rupture of the heart. And if that's the case, blood gathered in that pericardial sac for 2 hours till the Roman soldiers came by, speared it. And what came out of that was the sedimented red cell and the clear serum, the blood and the water of John. So tamponade pericardial friction rub is the second lots of noise in the algorithm. Let's move on. This is the third lots of noise. Is a middle-aged man who comes in with a congested X-ray, is diagnosed by the house staff as having some sort of pneumonia. They're concerned about tuberculosis, but they also pick up a murmur. And the following day, they take me to the bedside and they tell me that they think this murmur is aortic regurgitation. The murmur is different. This is a murmur that never ends. It's to and fro, machinery-like, training tunnel, never ending. So what you have here is a communication between two blood circuits of different pressure. You have a patent ductus arteriosus. And that's basically what this person had. Let's move on. So that's the third lots of noise. The last four lots of noise has something to do with Henry Fonda, who died of heart failure. 75-year-old award-winning actor comes to your office complaining of increasing and debilitating shortness of breath. When you examine him, you find the following. So what you have here is lots of noise, a murmur in systole and a murmur in diastole. So let's review. This is the first sound, the second sound, murmur throughout systole going into the second sound. So this is mitral regurgitation. And then all the blood that regurgitated will have to come forward in diastole, giving this extra sound, which is an S3, and this little additional rumble. So lots of noise. So this is mitral regurgitation. So once again, this is the fourth and last in our algorithm on the left side of lots of noises. Let's review it. If you have lots of noise, you have either severe aortic regurgitation, severe mitral regurgitation, a patent ductus arteriosus, or a three-component pericardial friction rub. Now, let's move on to the other side. Mitral regurgitation, by the way, is classified by the fact that it goes into the second sound and touches the second sound. Most mitral regurgitations, however, are silent. If you hear the murmur, you're much more likely to have it, clinically relevant. And if the murmur comes with a diastolic component, which means lots of noise, it's much more likely to be severe. In fact, the presence of a diastolic component is 90% of the cases with severe regurgitation. So not only you make the diagnosis, but you also assess the severity. Okay, now let's move on to an additional murmur, this time in systole. 24-year-old medical student comes to see you complaining of an atypical chest pain before an important exam. The pain comes and goes and is not associated to any symptom. Everything else on the exam is normal. And when you listen to her, you pick up the following. There is a murmur, but that murmur is not lots of noise. It's only in systole. Now, if you can see it with your mind's eye, you realize that this murmur does not cover all of systole. Cover the second half of systole. In fact, let me give you a cartoon. This is what this event would sound without the murmur. There's an extra sound. It's in systole. It's in mid to late systole. It's a click. And it's the hallmark of mitral valve prolapse. The most common congenital valvular abnormality on the planet, 3 to 5% of the population. So what you have here is a mitral valve that has a redundant leaflet, long corded, and it billows back during systole. May create this click, may also create a late systolic murmur. Now, yesterday when we did the Leonardo talk, we mentioned how the most important term, the most important word, the magic word in medicine is bullshit. So you always have to challenge dogma. And this is a good example of how holy cows make great burgers. The particular person that made a burger of this holy cow is one of my heroes. His name was John Brereton Barlow. He was a South African. So he was the ultimate outsider because South Africa in those years was a pariah state. He went to school in Johannesburg, mostly on a rugby scholarship. He was a good athlete. He was also a bright medical student, but he was always coming up with bizarre diagnoses. And he made himself a reputation for always thinking out of the box. Now, in the US, they say that when you hear hoof beats, you don't think of a horse, but you think of a zebra. And they call you a zebra. So a zebra is somebody who thinks differently, an eccentric. Now, in South Africa, they have so many zebras that they call them canaries. So when they became chief of cardiology, he always kept a cage of canaries in his office. Then he goes to war, and after the war, he goes to England, where he trains with an iconoclastic Brit. And this fellow teaches him how to always challenge dogma. Trust no one, doubt everything, which is basically what I encapsulate in my bullshit. And sends him back to South Africa with a plaque that says, holy cows make great burgers, which is, by the way, a quote from Mark Twain. The cow that he went after had been put in the medical literature by an influential Frenchman called Galaverdin. Galaverdin had heard these clicks. They had been heard for decades, but he was convinced that they were due to pleuropericardial adhesions. Barlow said bullshit and goes on to prove that it's in reality a billowing, redundant mitral leaflet. Unfortunately for him, he's a nobody. He comes from South Africa, he doesn't have a name, and he's going after dogma. He's a pioneer, and pioneers are recognized by the arrows in the back. So he cannot publish the paper. Paper eventually makes it in the Hopkins Medical Journal, which is the same Crowley that has created a very beautiful software to teach cardiac auscultation, and that's how mitral valve prolapse eventually becomes standard, the most common congenital valvular abnormality on the planet. Notice his mischievous smile and how he stands in front of the equivalent of my bullshit. Never trust a cardiac catheter report. Never trust an echocardiogram report. Never trust the diagnosis or opinion of a senior consultant. Going back to observation, do you see anything unusual on the face of this man? He's got a big potato nose. All right. So let's talk a little bit about that. We call that in medicine rhinophyma. And the very first description is by an artist. This is Ghirlandaio, who trained Michelangelo. And this tempera, which is at the Louvre, is very symbolic. What Ghirlandaio is trying to tell us is unconditional love. The young grandchild adores his grandfather, even though the grandfather has a nauseating appearance because of the rhinophyma. Rembrandt portrayed his own rosacea and rhinophyma in many of his self-portraits. A fellow who had a humongous rhinophyma was J.P. Morgan, the banker, the US banker. And he was very obsessed with the pictures of his rhinophyma, and he always went after reporters that tried to take a picture. This is the only one that we have of him because he confiscated all the other ones, and you can see the bulbous nose. We had a president a few years ago that had a little bit of a rosacea and became evident when he got upset. Which, of course, brings us to the big question, did Pinocchio have rhinophyma? Now, Pinocchio did not. Pinocchio had variable rhinomegaly related to his telling lies. And he went this way. At his third lie, his nose grew so long he could no longer run around. The fairy looked at him and laughed. Why are you laughing? I'm laughing at the lie you told. How do you know I told a lie? Lies, my dear boy, are quickly discovered because they come in two flavors. They're either lies with short legs or lies with long noses, and yours long nose variety. I give a talk on how artists often came to the truth much earlier than physicians. There's no doubt that colon to the inside of the Pinocchio effect much. So what am I talking about? Well, guys in the audience, be aware that we have two organs that share the unfortunate property of vascular erectile tissue, which basically means they can engorge the control of our will. One is the penis and the other one is the nose. So if you wake up in the middle of the night with a stuffed something and a stuffed nose, that's the reason. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because when you lie, your nose vasodilates against your will. That may actually literally lengthen your nose and will give you an itch. So people that lie typically touch their nose. Pay attention. Now, this fellow in Chicago, who directs the Smell and Taste Research Foundation there, has used this to test the famous Bill Clinton testimony in the Monica Lewinsky affair. Clinton was lying, or at least was legally inaccurate. He was touching his nose. Then he went and did the same idea on the O.J. Simpson trial. Remember the guy who killed his wife but claimed that he did not? And very much the same, which proves that he that has eyes to see and ears to hear will soon realize that no human being can keep a secret. And that's because if his lips are silent, he still chatters with his fingertips, so the betrayal oozes out of him at every pore. And that's Sigmund Freud. Now, Yogi Berra, who's an Italian-American baseball player, put it much better. You can observe a lot by watching. All right, so we have exhausted a part of the algorithm. Let's see the next one. And this is me. So 15 years ago, midlife crisis hit. So when midlife crisis hits, usually you have three options. You divorce your wife, you buy a convertible, or you run for president. None of these options was feasible, so I decided to go to Nepal. And I worked in a Nepali clinic in the middle of nowhere. And one morning I woke up and I was having breakfast in front of my tent, and I noticed this patient to come in to see me. He was a basket case. The son had walked for 5 hours uphill, carrying his father so that I could see him. 62-year-old villager is brought by basket to your clinic in the mountains of Nepal. Thanks to a friendly translator, you understand he has been having increasing and debilitating shortness of breath. When you examine him, you find the following. There's a little bit of background noise, but basically notice here is a typical triple lilt, very much like the one that Beethoven used in the opening of his scherzo from the 9th, tum-tara, tum-tara, tum-tara. In addition, there is a diastolic rumble, tum-taraf, 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 tum-taraf. So this is full-blown mitris. In Nepal, everybody had it. So in the algorithm, where are we now? Well, we are in diastole. And if the murmur is not lots of noise, but it's in diastole, it's going to be abnormal. You just have to work it up. So if you're developing an electronic algorithm, there is no doubt that any diastolic murmur will have to be worked up because will be pathologic by default. This is the cartoon of the murmur, and you get a sense of how this extra sound is followed by this long, low-pitched diastolic murmur going into the next cycle. Now, mitral stenosis could be reduced to the extra sound, like in this case, tuntara, tuntara, just an open snap, which was the Beethoven's scherzo. Now, they have typical phases, so you can make diagnosis that the Germans call it Augenblick, in English. They have these cyanotic and sometimes very impressive cheekbones. And notice also the cyanotic acrocyanosis, the cyanosis of the body. All right, what do you see on Robin Williams? May his soul rest in peace. He was actually one of my heroes. Okay, now you're able to see a physical finding. You see anything there? He has an earlobe crease. So Robin Williams had aged really badly. He had been diagnosed with Parkinson's. How do you get Parkinson's? Cocaine. So, and actually amphetamines. So for example, there's an epidemic of Parkinson coming up because of all the children with attention deficit that are on amphetamines. Who knows what's going to happen? Deplete the substantia nigra transmitters, and you end up with that. And so one of the theories why Michael J. Fox got Parkinson's is because of cocaine. And he had done a lot of cocaine. On the other hand, when they finally did an autopsy, what they found is that he actually had much more than that. He had a progressive dementia condition that presents with Parkinsonian syndrome, and that's why he killed himself. But why am I presenting it together with Barbara Walters, who's not one of my heroes? And she is not one of my heroes either, because all of them share a cardiac had aortic stenosis. Now, in Barbara Walters and Barbara Bush, it was just part of getting older. In the olden days, the people that got aortic stenosis were people, young people afflicted by rheumatic disease. In the West, nowadays, it's either old people who calcify normal valves or relatively young people who have a predisposing condition to stenose the valve. And I'm talking about the famous bicuspid valve of Arnold Schwarzenegger. So if you have a bicuspid aortic valve, in your 40s may leak, and you have aortic regurgitation, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and in your 50s, 60s may stenose, and you have what happened to Robin Williams. So Robin Williams really had early atherosclerotic disease. This is pretty much an issue, and he looked much older. And then he had this condition of dementia/Parkinson, for which he eventually took his own life. All right, so the most difficult part of the algorithm, it's the systolic murmur. So let's review. If there is lots of noise, systole and diastole, you work it up because it's always pathologic. Bad aortic regurgitation, bad mitral regurgitation, pericardial friction rub, and patent ductus arteriosus. If it's in diastole, you know by definition that you have to work it up because all diastolic murmurs are pathologic. Could be the mitral stenosis of my patient in Nepal, could be aortic regurgitation. Either way, you work it up. That's easy. If the murmur is in systole and touches S2, mitral valve prolapse, or mitral regurgitation in general, you work it up. Anything that goes into S2 is pathologic. The only one you have a problem is this one, the systolic ejection murmur of Robin Williams. Spares S2. And there is good second sound here. So what is this? This is not aortic stenosis. This is a benign flow murmur that so many people have. So if you're developing an algorithm, this is really the problem. How do you separate the good systolic ejection the pregnant women have, the young children have. 80 to 90% of young children have a systolic ejection murmur, including yours truly. And I was forced by an Italian pediatrician to play goalie throughout my childhood because I had a murmur, when in reality it was a benign murmur. So how do you separate the benign murmur from the pathologic that sounds like this? The one of Robin Williams. Much louder, soft to absent sound. So let's review. The golden rule in murmurs is the longer, the louder. So if the murmur goes like this, gosh, much more likely to be bad than where the murmur is soft, is early, and there is a good second sound, very much like in that cartoon. So this would be benign. And this would actually be pathologic. Okay, so that's basically my algorithm. That's how we teach med students. And of course, that's in many ways what our brain does once navigates the maze of murmurs. So again, sparse S2, which means it's ejection. Usually the three criteria to separate the good ejection from the bad ejection are early versus late and the preservation versus the absence of the second sound. All right, so are these important? The stethoscope is coming up for the 200th anniversary. If you survey program directors in internal medicine or family medicine, everybody agrees that this is important, and yet we don't teach it. This is the teaching of lung auscultation. Only 1 out of 10 residency program in the US teach it. For cardiac auscultation, it's 3 out of 10. They all assume that the residents know it. And turns out that they are wrong because the residents are not really that good at it. This is an old study I did. In red, very accurate recognition are cardiology fellows. The residents, and in green are the medical students. The medical students are not any worse than the residents. Together, they are wrong 3 out of 4 times. Residents spend as much as 30 to 40% of their time teaching students. And if that's the case, it's like this Bruegel's painting of the blind leading the blind, all ending up in a ditch. When I did this study, I got comments back, and this particular program director wrote, I was well trained in clinical auscultation, even spent time in England, but now we have echoes. We don't really need the stethoscope anymore. And that's in many ways what we've been talking the past 2 days. How can you prove that this technology that is 200 years old, that was invented a year after the Battle of Waterloo by a Frenchman who was too shy to put his naked ear over the naked chest of a young woman, still has a role in medicine? I believe it does, but needs to be proven. This program director was even more blunt. Meticulous auscultation is an old art, but it's gone. Would you rather have a fellow with a 2D echo or a faculty man with only the stethoscope? Here is wrong, because when you're out in the trenches and you need to screen and identify what needs evaluation, technology evaluation, you need to rely on your clinical skills. If you don't have clinical skills, you will embark on a path where tests beget tests. And at that end of that very expensive path, usually wait a lawyer, a surgeon, and an undertaker. So you definitely need clinical skills. Yet, as early as 1961, in this textbook of pulmonary diseases, the author wrote, the stethoscope is mostly decorative. The only value is that anxious patients feel a lot better as soon as they sense the chest piece over their pectoral muscles. If you have to buy a stethoscope for that reason, buy a cheap one. And yet, if we look at the future, and I am a Star Trek fan, Dr. McCoy, as you probably know, carries a tricorder. And the tricorder allows him to make brilliant diagnoses, and they usually go like this. Zoom is dead, Jim. Here's my last slide. And I am a believer that auscultation still has a medicine, but more importantly, I'm a believer that clinical interaction between two human beings is very important to the art of medicine. Medicine is a science. That's actually in many ways why we're fascinated by people like Leonardo, because they embody both. And that's probably why many of us went into medicine, because it was both. It's becoming more and more and more skewed towards the science. And I would suggest that that's a loss. The stethoscope allows us the early detection of critical findings, serial inexpensive follow-up, allows us the physical contact with the patient, which may have therapeutic value. And in times when there's fun, there is a lot of fun in making a diagnosis using your senses and your wits. Danny Apsey is a physician and philosopher, and he wrote a poem on the stethoscope. And the first stanza captures so well what this little tool is to our craft. Through a stethoscope, over a young woman's abdomen tense, I heard the sound of creation, and over a dead man's chest, the silence before creation began. Thank you so much for having me, and I really, really appreciate the past 2 days. Thank you so much.
So, Professor Mangione, thank you so much. What a really nice talk. I think it's late, but maybe we have time for one question from the audience. I've been asking questions to Professor Mangione for the last 2 days and discussing ideas. So I can make one question, but it's much more interesting if you have it. Sure.
I'm a professional.